Good morning. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Regulation Navigation brought to you by ITS. This is a webinar series that is centered around regulation-related topics that cover high-level compliance requirements and topics and give an opportunity for you to learn something new or validate what you may already know or ask questions affecting your operations. I'm Chris Taylor. I'm ITS's Vice President of Learning and Product, and our conversation today will be centered around discussing the changes to the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, or ASME's B31Q standard, which saw a new edition published earlier this year. In a moment, I'll be joined by Amy Livingston of Kinder Morgan, who's a current committee member and former chair of the B31Q Technical Committee. We'll also touch on some of the latest regulatory news for our industry. But before we get started, just some housekeeping items to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session will be recorded, and as a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice and should never be utilized as your only source of information. Please review the disclaimer on the screen before acting on any advice given and seek guidance from legal counsel or other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. We'll have time at the end of the session where you can anonymously ask questions about the topics we discussed today. Please type your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll address those questions as time permits or respond to you through email if you do leave your contact information. Also, we offer 0.1 CEUs, or continuing education units, that you may be able to apply to your professional development hours. After the webinar, we send out a feedback form, an email that has a link to a feedback form that you can fill out and return to us if you would like a certificate for those CEU credits. We're going to begin today with an update on some industry regulatory news, starting with a few recent announcements from the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, as we all call it. And if you're on those email notifications, what a flurry it's been. Just last week, PHMSA published two advanced notice of proposed rulemakings. These are ANRPMs. One's titled Mandatory Regulatory Reviews to Unleash American Energy and Improve Government Efficiency, and is seeking comments for current requirements needing repeal or amendment in the federal code to eliminate undue burdens on the identification, development, and use of our domestic energy resources. So seeking comment from industry and from public on what could be. One moment. Okay. All righty. There's another ANRPM is also seeking stakeholder feedback on whether to repeal or amend any requirements in the hazardous materials rulemaking procedures and program procedures, or the hazardous materials regulations themselves. So comments for both of these ANRPMs, Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemakings, must be submitted by August 4th, and will include in the in our follow-up email those links to those ANRPMs so that you can go view those. They've got tons of topics that they're seeking, or specific questions that they're seeking comment from industry on, and we encourage you to be a part of that conversation and really affect the regulatory landscape with your perspective. PHMSA's Office of Chief Counsel recently issued a pair of policy memos revising procedures for pipeline safety enforcement proceedings, specifically regarding case file content and how proposed civil penalties are calculated. Both memos are now in effect as of the end of May, and you can find details in a link that we'll send out in an email as well. They both have to do with how civil penalties are calculated and the availability of the case file contents themselves. So PHMSA previously announced another ANRPM for repair criteria for hazardous liquid and gas transmission pipelines. Again, this is soliciting stakeholder feedback on potential opportunities to improve cost effectiveness of the repair requirements for gas transmission and hazardous liquid or carbon dioxide pipelines. Again, we'll share that link. Comments for that are due by July 21st, so a little less runway if that affects you and you're just now getting into that. And another ANRPM concerning the modernization of our Code of Federal Regulations, Part 193. Now, this is related to liquid natural gas, or LNG. This was issued earlier this year, and it's got about 8 areas of potential amendments. It's seeking comment due by July 7th. So as we will see in the coming future, as the rulemaking process kind of unfolds, they're going to take comments, they'll issue an NPRM, they'll have GPAC meetings, and eventually issue final rules. According to a source at the American Gas Association, over the last couple of years, we've been covering and talking about, and industry's been engaging on the leak detection and repair, or LDAR, final rule, which was held up by the Trump administration's transition. And we were told it's likely going to be completely reset and go through a completely new rulemaking process. That's what the American Gas Association shared at their recent conference and then talks that they've had with PHMSA. However, we were also told that this isn't PHMSA's highest priority. The LDAR isn't, and I think we've seen what their highest priority is with all these ANRPMs that have been coming out. And as a reminder, LDAR is something that will have to have some kind of action by PHMSA to affect federal code, because it was the impetus of the rule comes from mandates from the 2020 Pipes Act directives from Congress that were related to pipeline repair and methane release. Here's another one. As directed by a Trump administration executive order, PHMSA is amending or has amended its regulation language to change the name of the body of water known as the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America in the 49 CFR 195 and 192 regulations. It was published in the Federal Register on May 20th, and it has an effective date within 30 days, which that would put that next Thursday, June 19th. So that is now considered the Gulf of America as far as CFR code is concerned. In another topic, on April 9th, a gas explosion destroyed one home and damaged a couple others in Missouri. And this unfortunately resulted in a death and 2 injuries. The National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB, issued a preliminary report, and that stated that the cause was from a subcontractor drilling into an unmarked underground gas main, installing fiber optic cable. Fiber is being installed throughout the country. It's a grave threat to and damage prevention issue. And unfortunately, despite the operator reportedly conducting a line locate, the uncapped gas main was apparently not marked as found by the investigation. That investigation is still ongoing. And I think it'll take a year usually before you end up seeing a final investigation report. Speaking of which, NTSB just released earlier, a couple months ago, I believe, its final report on the 2023 natural gas explosion at a Pennsylvania chocolate factory that killed 7 people. Um, we'll share links to these reports as well in our follow-up email. But in this investigation, investigators determined the blast was caused by a leak that leaked from a retired Aldol A plastic service tee, which migrated through the ground and ignited inside the facility. The tea's failure was attributed to long-term degradation, exacerbated by exposure to elevated elements from a nearby leaking steam line. Um, I think the more important thing to carry for industry here is that the NDSB is advising that all regulated natural gas distribution pipeline operators address the risk associated with Aldol A service tees, especially those with Delrin inserts, including replacing or remediating them. So please be aware of that if that affects if you have those that type of material or components in your systems. They also recommended that states require the installation of natural gas alarms in businesses, residences, and other buildings where people congregate, because apparently odor of this gas was detected, reported, etc. And unfortunately, within minutes, I think the explosion happened, but there probably was a chance to evacuate that wasn't taken. And a couple more news items before we get into our topic today. Back in March, PHMSA released an advisory bulletin urging all regulated pipeline operators to voluntarily adopt pipeline safety management systems, or PSMS, per the American Petroleum Institute API's recommended practice 1173. So again, urging to voluntarily adopt. Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy, emphasized PSMS is key to boosting energy security and reducing costs, while PHMSA's acting administrator Ben Kochman called it a much-needed evolution toward zero incidents. PHMSA is encouraging operators to implement a robust PSMS, continuously improve it, and foster a strong safety culture. The advisory bulletin emphasizes again that the PSMS is still considered to be voluntary. And last on the news items on a state level, there have been some new regulations that are now on the books in Massachusetts. And this is just interesting for the industry to watch, even if you're not in Massachusetts or have operations in Massachusetts. But effective later this year in October, all operator qualification programs must comply with some of the following changes. This is not exhaustive, but these are the interesting things. Span of control, which we'll talk about later and we'll define later in this webinar, is no longer permitted in the state, or won't be after October. The new language reads that those who perform OQ covered tasks shall be qualified. And it also notes that inspectors and supervisors must also be qualified so yet another state going much further and above and beyond federal requirements. Abnormal operating conditions must now be task specific. Business districts will require annual leak surveys. Ratios for inspectors must be 1 inspector to 2 contractor crews. And each operator who utilizes a contractor to perform gas work must evaluate their contractor qualifications. They surely should be doing that anyway, but this just shows like those items are now in state code. Kind of shows what those regulators are going to be looking at and what other state regulators could be looking at doing in the coming future. We'll watch. But now today, we're going to move to our topic with our guest. So with the recent publication of ASME B31Q's 2025 edition and its importance to so many operators' OQ programs, we're highlighting the significant changes of that new edition and also previewing a new non-mandatory appendix that details the process in which span of control ratios recommended in the standard were originally established. So we'll talk about that at the end of the webinar. That new non-mandatory appendix is not in this 2025 edition, but we'll talk about that as well. It's coming. It'll be in the next edition, and we got a little surprise for you on that. So for those that are new to B31Q altogether, we're going to cover some B31Q basics, including its history, its application in the pipeline industry, and how to get involved in the B31Q committee if that interests you. So with me is our guest, Amy Livingston, training manager at Kinder Morgan and a committee member with B31Q and former chair of the committee. Among her many accomplishments, Amy has a PhD, so it's actually Dr. Amy Livingston, in her PhD is in industrial and organizational psychology from Auburn University. And as a training manager for Kinder Morgan in the operator qualification or OQ department, Amy provides support for the OQ program, a natural gas field employee promotion process, and field operations technical training. In addition to participating on industry training committees, Amy was one of the original members of the ASME B31Q Pipeline Personnel Qualification Standards Committee, and served as chair for 6 years. So a wealth of knowledge. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start by getting everyone on the same page about what ASME B31Q is and why it's so important for the pipeline industry. So ASME B31Q, it's actually an international industry standard that establishes the requirements for developing and implementing an effective pipeline qualification, personnel qualification program, so OQ program. And it utilizes a combination of technically based data, accepted industry practices, and consensus-based decision-making. The standard offers guidance and examples of a variety of methods that may be used to meet requirements for establishing an effective OQ program, and it specifies a list of common covered tasks that impact the safety or integrity of pipelines, and it outlines how to qualify individuals to perform those tasks and for managing the qualifications of those people, of those individuals. Amy, do you have anything to add, as we talk about like at a high level what B31Q is?
That pretty much sums it up.
Thank you. I was
in
trying
in
to
a, in
stop
a nice
talking.
nutshell.
Well, as I understand it, and as we know, 6 years of being chair, being there from the beginning, you have quite a history of an involvement with B31Q. Can you give us some of the background to its origins? Like, how did the standard start, and how has it evolved over the years?
Yeah. So when the OQ rule was first effective, probably same as any regulation, excuse me, both operators and PHMSA had problems with it. 13 to be exact. Later they reduced it to 12. Basically, regulators didn't feel the regulation went far enough, and operators felt regulators were asking for things beyond what was required. So, about the 12 to 13 issues, interestingly, meetings like this one um, and other industry meetings, that's what reduced it from 13 problems to 12. We basically convinced them that we play well together and routinely share best practices. So that reduced it from 13 to 12. About the same time that OQ was disliked, uh, PHMSA and operators considered the cooperative development of ASME B31.8 for integrity management and its incorporation by reference as a success. So back to OQ. To address the problems with OQ, PHMSA held 3 public meetings to discuss the 12 or 13 issues, and the result was an agreement for ASME to sponsor the cooperative development of a standard, B31Q, like what was done for integrity management.
Sometimes I've been asked, like, what's up with the name B31Q? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can't speak to how ASME names all of their standards, but This was their way of putting the standard for pipeline personnel qualification along with other pressure pipeline related standards. So B31.8 was the inspiration and B31Q was born. So uh, B is for boiler and pressure code, 31 is for pressure pipe.
That helps. And I've heard that the B31Q is, I think, I mean, at least when I heard it a couple of years ago, if the reliable source, it's the only people process that ASME has. Everything else is really technical,
Mechanical in nature.
mechanical.
Imagine that. Yeah.
Well, who makes up this committee? I think you kind of spoke to that a little bit with its origin, but I mean, today, like who makes up? What are the stakeholders in the committee?
First of all, committees are open to the public, so anyone can come. But in terms of who truly comes and participates, it's everybody in the industry. It's state and federal regulators, operators from all segments of the industry to include gas and liquids, distribution and transmission, contractor community, industry associations, labor, vendors, pretty much everybody in our industry has a part and a role to play.
Yeah, it's a great collection of industry voices. You know, the wealth of knowledge and the ear to the ground, the networking you get from these kind of events that are regularly held is invaluable. Can you give us a picture of what a typical meeting is like?
Yeah, for a typical meeting, we first meet together to go through some updates of what's going on with the standard itself, but also in our industry. You know, Chris, as you just mentioned, it's a good time to share information and so on. So we do that, and then we break out into teams, and there are two major teams. Team one basically deals with the entire task list and everything associated with that, and team two for everyone on the call or webinar. Chris is our team two leader, so he doesn't really need a guest for all of this, but I'm happy to be here anyway.
No one
Um,
wants to hear
so.
me talking the whole time.
So I'll pitch in here.
Thank you.
Um, So I'm on team two. So we get into our teams and we discuss whatever action items that we have going and try to make progress on those. And then the next day we get back together and the teams we report on progress, discuss issues where the team needs further uh, direction from the committee. That happens a lot. Or sometimes we formally vote on action items where we've found consensus. um, the debates that we have, they're interesting to us, but not so much to others. Probably um, we really go into detail about little words like may and shall, and or, and you know we've all seen those funny memes where there's unfortunate comma placement. So you know we try to avoid all of that. So there's a lot of really mundane discussion that goes on that um, that the attention to the details is important for a standard.
It really is. Like, I mean, words matter, and so if you would consider yourself, I've heard other people call it like, "Hey, can we be OQ nerds for a minute and really hash this out?" You know, you really get into a lot. But then if you're someone that's passionate about the Oxford comma, this could be a
Exactly.
right place for you.
Exactly.
So yeah, we spoke about the benefits; they're invaluable. But as for the document itself, one of the greatest values the standard provides is that, in my view, is that for each covered task that's defined in the standard, there's minimum procedure steps that are defined that are needed to perform the task. These are derived from subject matter experts consensus across companies across the industry. Amy, what benefits? What are the benefits you most frequently highlight about ASME B31Q, the document?
Yeah, I agree. The task list and all the associated information with that is the most valuable contribution. It's valuable particularly to drive consistency in our industry and for those who don't have a resource, internally to develop their own task list or program. It's really helpful to them. I also think that for those who are trying to create their own programs, the non-mandatory appendices that are provided are really helpful. They're technically sound processes that they can implement themselves. So I think those are pretty valuable as well.
Thank you. As far as the content in B31Q goes, we have a lot of different elements to talk about that are listed on the screen. So that, I mean, for instance, these what you see on screen, these are um, essentially the sections of the document. And we're not going to go into every one of those, but there are terms and definitions defined, listed. They have OQ program details, how to determine the tasks themselves, and details about abnormal operating conditions, you name it. And like you said, technical procedures even for decision making. So B31Q outlines the standards for developing an OQ program and the processes and procedures. It has guidance for how to develop covered tasks. It outlines the standards for training, for evaluations and how to perform those evaluations and or the types of evaluations, methods, and for granting qualifications. Amy, that's so much material for an OQ program manager to go through. Where would you advise someone to begin if they're just starting out, and evaluating their OQ program to adopt B31Q or use B31Q to improve their program?
So, like we like to say, there's an app for that. So, non-mandatory Appendix H actually gives detailed advice on implementation of B31Q. So we have a whole section specifically dedicated to that. It includes a detailed table that lines out the excuse me, B31Q requirements. So you can use it to document how your program compares and list any changes you might want to make and list any areas where you just may differ but don't want to make any changes. So it
I
kind of
love
gives you the option to document all that.
that. Makes me crack up. There's an appendix for that, app for that. Something to point out about B31Q, I mentioned earlier, it's considered an international standard, so it doesn't necessarily directly tie or cite, the United States Code of Federal Regulations. Obviously, that plays into, a lot of discussion, a lot of consideration, but it's an international standard. So where most of the industry currently in most states, identifies covered tasks using the four-part test. Essentially, that's defined in federal code in Part 192 or 195. The B31Q standard actually uses what's considered a two-part test, and I want to take a moment to consider the differences between a two-part and a four-part test in determining, is this something I need? Is this task that we're performing something that we need a qualification for? Should it be a covered task? Um, so first, there's far more focused and specific four-part tests that we have listed on the screen here. The four-part test is very widely used. It's not the only option, and some states require the further reaching two-part tests. So you can see, you know, if there's a real difference here in a two-part test is it doesn't matter if it's required by federal code, and it doesn't matter if it's an operation or a maintenance task. Usually in other words, that means is it a new construction task? It really, at the end of the day, if it answers yes to is it being performed on the pipeline or the right of way, and does it impact safety or integrity of the pipeline or its of the pipeline facility, then that's should be considered a covered task. So a little different there, and I guess when we say wider reaching, that means more tasks could apply or could be on the list because there's less criteria to say no to. Amy, can you give folks some guidance as they consider what these guidelines mean for their programs?
Yeah, so you've mentioned B31Q is an international standard, which is why we have the two-part test because that's what we could justify. But the reality, we are here in the United States of America, and we are under a regulation that currently requires the four-part test, or as you mentioned, in some states, the two-part test. So the short answer is that you need to follow whichever test your regulator requires. So We know, though, that that gets complicated for some operators who operate in multiple states with different requirements. So at that point, you've got a choice: either have one program that complies with the most conservative option, or multiple programs that you apply selectively. There are obviously pros and cons for both options, and your management's appetite for risk, along with cost considerations, will probably be the determining factors. So, the additional cost for adding new construction, particularly for contractors, is exponential. On the other hand, having a more conservative and consistent approach is possibly safer and easier to manage. So, you've got to weigh your options, and each operator has to do that.
Thank you. I think that's a good way to look at it. I feel like we've gotten a kind of a handle on what B31Q is, what the standard, I mean, again, if you have never opened it, try to get your hands on it or purchase a copy, and dig into that thing. It really can help improve your program if you're not using it. I think we've got a handle on what it is. So let's kind of talk about and shift our focus to this latest revision. So the previous edition was published back in 2021. And typically there's, I think, a 2-year cycle, but pandemic, COVID, and a lot of other reasons, I think, uh, made this to be a 2025 edition. And we're going to bounce around a bit and hit on several of the revision points in this latest edition. So first up, one new covered task was added. 0637, vacuum box inspection of tank welds. This is a non-destructive testing method that uses a technique of bubble leak testing to locate leaks in a pressure boundary in order to check the soundness of annular and bottom joints, both long seam and short seam joints, and welded joints for annular plates on tanks. So previously there were, I think, 4 NDT, non-destructive testing tasks in the standard. Now there are 5. And besides the new task that was added, 7 tasks had minor wording revisions because we added a new definition of pipe uh, into the definitions section. And pipe is now defined as the tubular component of a pipeline to which valves, fittings, and other components are attached. And so because this definition was added, these tasks that had previously used the word pipeline changed to pipe. And you can either in title or within their evaluation criteria or contents, and you can see those tasks on screen. So very minor adjustment to those tasks, just some wording changes, nothing significant to the scope of those tasks. So I think that's helpful information to know. But there were also several changes to normative language where before the standard used may, and that was changed to should or shall across the document. And those were also added as defined terms as well. Amy, let's talk about, you talked earlier about the importance of language and the words and then word choice within a standard. Can you share your thoughts on these specific changes? How are they distinct, and why was this change important?
Yeah, so the definitions now included are: may is the word used to denote permission, neither a requirement nor a recommendation; shall, the word used to denote a requirement; and should, the word used to denote a recommendation. So it matters when you're setting a standard to say whether someone has to do something. So that would be a shall; whether they should do it, and if they're not going to, they probably need to justify why they didn't; or whether they're kind of allowed, which would be the may. So as you mentioned, the importance gets back to the fact that words matter, even the little tiny ones. Um, Particularly for standards and regulations that define minimum requirements. So we're trying to be very specific when we come up with minimum and maximum requirements. And, we've been at this since 2003, so it's hard to be consistent when you're writing a standard as a committee over many years. So this effort was to more consistently use and define these important terms. In my review of the changes, there was one that I had to think about, but I ultimately agreed with it. The others made the language more clear and consistent with what we really originally intended. So I didn't see any changes in there that really changed the intent of what we were trying to do.
Is there an instance of one of these changes that you'd like to highlight to the audience?
So of these changes, really the only ones that matter are the ones from may or should to shall. And I found six of those. So there are six. But, again, I think we really originally meant shall in those cases. So, for example, in section six for AOCs, it said the qualified individuals performing a covered task should be able to recognize and properly react to AOCs. The regulation really meant shall, and B31Q did too.
That's a yeah, what a good update there. And again, for consistency, for clarity, there's some new guidance from B31Q in section 8 and specifically in 8.2.3. And it's around the evaluation method selection, and it states all tasks require knowledge, but not all require skill. In other words, you could say that a performance evaluation is not the same thing as a skill evaluation. In fact, most of the tasks evaluated require knowledge, but few require skill. Can you elaborate on that? Because I think that's a really helpful point for folks to understand and apply in their programs.
Yeah, this is one of those instances where a technical term is used in normal speech indiscriminately. And so this is like most people use training and qualification interchangeably. We've all heard that, and those of us who are in the OQ industry certainly know there's a technical difference between the two. Um, People also use the term skill and performance interchangeably. And normally this doesn't matter, but it does when you're trying to create a minimum requirement in a standard. Again, you have to be very, very specific. So, this distinction is most important when you're trying to determine whether you need performance evaluation for subsequent qualification. So, if you believe that they are the same thing, you will believe that every task has to have a performance evaluation for both initial and subsequent qualification, when in fact, most tasks don't require a skill. So, from a technical testing perspective, a skill requires a special mix of physical and cognitive cooperation. And there are some questions that we have listed in one of the non mandatory appendices in B31Q that you can use to think about to tell the difference between the two. But the easiest one to talk about today is whether or not the activity requires a lot of practice to get your mind and body to work together to become proficient. So, some examples of skill include welding, typing, riding a bike. Most tasks don't take that level of psychomotor cooperation. Rather, you get better by understanding it better, which is actually an increase in knowledge. So, for most knowledge based tasks, B31Q requires a performance evaluation for initial qualification to show that they can apply the knowledge. They aren't testing a skill, they're testing about whether or not someone can apply what they understand. Once they've proven that, testing their continued knowledge should be sufficient for subsequent qualification. Now, having said all that, remember the intent of this technical standard is to define the minimum requirement. So there is no problem with an operator requiring performance for subsequent qualification in their programs. Going above and beyond the requirement is always encouraged.
Well, talking about the list of the tasks that we discussed earlier, one of the revisions in the edition in non-mandatory Appendix A, which is, I think, the list of tasks, specifies that operators shall remove any tasks from that list if they determine them to not be covered tasks and should also document the rationale for not including them. Amy, does this say that operators should only have tasks in their OQ plans that they or their contractors are actually performing?
It kind of does, yeah. And that's actually the one may to shall change that I had to really think about and read
Okay.
over a couple times. So that section 5.5 is for when an operator chooses to implement the task list in B31Q. And B31Q has always required that the operator go through the effort with SMEs to make it their own. So it's always required that. So the first step is to identify all applicable tasks. Obviously, if something isn't applicable, it's easy to justify to PHMSA that that task is not needed in your list. The second step is saying that if a task is performed, but your SMEs deem it should not be a DOT covered task, so you don't want to put it in your requirements list, you have to document the justification for that. So this gives backup to your decision when or if PHMSA asks, or your state regulator, why that B31Q task is not included in your program. And as a practical matter, having tasks on an operator's list that aren't performed, it's unnecessary at best, and ultimately could lead to some difficult questions from your regulator during an audit at worst. So it's just better to have a clean task and prove that you have uh, done your diligence and it is your task list and not somebody else's.
I think that's excellent advice and recommendation from the standard now. Some of the significant changes to B31Q involved span of control. And this is in section 9.4, where it doesn't actually call it span of control. It calls it the performance of covered tasks by non-qualified individuals, which is what span of control is in part. So before we jump in, I just want to define what span of control is for those that may not be familiar with it. So span of control is essentially a ratio that's defined by an operator in their OQ program, um, and that indicates the number of non-qualified individuals who can perform a task, but under the direction and observation and supervision of a qualified individual. So, Amy, in your experience, can you speak to the use of span of control in the industry? Why does it exist? What's it used for? What's its importance?
Yeah, the intent of the provision in the regulation was to allow for training and on the job practice under supervision. The problem is that this provision can be easily abused and used more for resource management. So, when you think about it, operators intend to keep employees over time. So, they have every reason to qualify employees, their own. Bigger concern is with the contractors who have employees who come and go frequently, and it's difficult to monitor their use or abuse of span of control.
So the new additions, in my view, one of the most significant, besides the new task, one of the most significant. Well, I like the language thing too. Again, just my view. But one of the most significant things that I saw in this new edition was this revision of the span of control, and it now it didn't really change the scope, but it outlines significantly more. It just made it clearer to me the explicit requirements for what I would call a qualified observer. Some of this was already in the standard, but uh, eh, such as just being present to respond to an AOC, but it makes it much more clear. The rest of it was either just kind of strongly implied or assumed. And now this revision really spells it out. You can see these on screen. Amy, what stands out to you about these requirements and what kinds of challenges are operators and contractors facing with span of control?
Yeah, it's always amazed me how hard it's been for people to get the concept that the qualified person has to be physically there and observing the non-qualified person during the entire time they're performing the task. How they think that a qualified individual can take a call, get a drink, go to the bathroom, or take any other kind of break and still be observing a non-qualified individual is beyond me. But, the reality is they probably do understand it. It's just too easy to violate, kind of like speeding, which, yeah, I violate that. Difference is, unlike speeding, consequences of faulty performance may be catastrophic at that time or a number of years later when you're talking about working on high pressure pipelines. So, I think that these changes are a pretty good attempt at making this provision and the requirements as clear as possible. The challenge really
Amy, I don't know if it's just me, but I lost audio from you. Bear with us, folks. Little Amy has left the meeting, and we'll hopefully. There you are. Yeah,
I think I'm
I
back.
hear you.
Okay, yay.
I don't know what
Who
happened.
knows?
Yeah,
So
but
how
I think you were talking about the challenges.
okay. So the challenges basically that that companies have, particularly contractors, is to use span of control for training and not to use it as the mechanism to increase staffing. So my hope is that the use of qualified individuals to direct and observe as required by being truly present as if they were performing the work themselves. I'm hoping that that actually helps organizations understand that it's easier to have qualified people perform the work than it is to abuse the span of control.
Thank you. Yeah, the revision to span of control, also added clarity on when to actually reduce ratios. So, like, based on situational risks. Can you elaborate on that? Uh-oh. I don't know what's going on with audio. Wonder if you have a flaky cord or something. No, I can't hear you. Just bear with us, folks. Sometimes we got Amy's rejoining. We got a little technical difficulty here.
Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. You're
It's,
back.
it says something about bandwidth, but I don't know if that's me or you or who knows.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
technically at a field location, so you never know.
Well, thank you for bearing with
Welcome,
us through that.
welcome to my life.
Yeah, no problem at all.
And
No.
everybody else is in the field.
Yep. I
Um,
think we all understand that challenge.
yeah. So you were asking about the span of control and
Yeah.
the need to possibly change. So yeah, it's intended to be a maximum number of individuals who can be directed and observed at one time. And this is under perfect conditions. So when we worked with SMEs to identify them, it's kind of like under the best conditions. How
Oh, I think we have another bandwidth issue. What a bummer. Let you rejoin again. But I think what you're saying is essentially, even if it says 1 to 3, you don't necessarily need to use that if a condition or a certain scenario really makes it unreasonable or that the qualified observer couldn't do their job. I don't know if you're back with us yet. I know what a fun time bandwidth issues are. I'm going to maybe help your bandwidth and get off video. Maybe you can too. I see you again. Can I hear you?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
I think we've broken the internet with
We sure have.
people who have joined us today. I think that's the deal. Congratulations.
It's your fault.
Ah, there we go.
Yep.
All right. So, excuse me, we were talking about this the span of control. So it was set as a maximum under
Yep.
perfect conditions. So it's the duty of the person who's directing and observing the qualified person to reduce it based on whatever's appropriate for the circumstances. So weather
Mhm.
issues, noise, distance, visual obstructions, communication barriers like what we just did. All those kinds of things would change your span of control.
Thank you. Yeah, and the new edition also clarified that helpers don't count towards span of control. What is meant by helpers?
Yeah, so over the years, there have been a lot of confusion about who all needs to be qualified when it takes multiple people to accomplish one task. So this tries to help clarify that. My personal way of thinking about it is if you're contributing brawn or a hand, no special knowledge or skill, then you probably don't need to be qualified. You are a helper.
Mm. So during work on the span of control over these few years between editions, some committee members asked, well, what was that maximum span of control ratio that's recommended in the standard? How were they originally determined? And Amy, I believe that you led that effort. Can you give us an overview of what that original effort entailed?
Sure. So yeah, there were always a lot of other committee members who participated in these
Mhm.
SME meetings, but I was the one who went to all of them to ensure that it was consistent and we did a complete review of the tasks. So as it's listed in B31Q, we used a consensus process to come up with each of the maximum spans of control. So first, we used a scale to discuss with SMEs about each of the tasks to help them think about what would impact the ability for someone to direct and observe the performance of each of the tasks. And then we had the SMEs independently rate the task. And after that, they compared their ratings. And so, where all the ratings were the same, we called it good and we set the maximum span of control as that. Where they had discrepancies, we had further discussion until they came to consensus. So that's what we did as the consensus process.
And the committee that has been working on and has recently developed, and I talked about this at the very beginning, a new non-mandatory appendix that's related to span of control guidance, and that SME consensus that you're just talking about for determining ratios. And that's expected, that's not in 2025 edition, folks. That's expected to be in the next edition as at this time, we're expecting that to be Appendix J. But this is not, again, in this latest edition. But the committee is currently working on publishing this guidance later this year, hopefully, in what's known in ASME terms as a code case. So this is, I think, B31Q's first ever code case expected to come out. So stay tuned for that. Um, Amy, how about a little preview of what that non-mandatory appendix looks like? What kind of information about determining span of control will we expect to see in this code case and eventually in the new appendix?
Yeah, a number of us, including myself, we were getting feedback from other operators who had adopted the B31Q task list that PHMSA was asking questions during audits about the method used to determine the span of control. So apparently, the fact that we said that we established it using a SME consensus process was not enough information for PHMSA and other regulators. So the new appendix answers that question, and it also goes further to give guidance and an improved scale to use in the event operators want to conduct a similar process themselves. So
Yeah.
as before, these non-mandatory appendices are really valuable. This one hopefully will be no different.
Thank you. So the first sections of the code case outlines the historical aspect, as Amy's covered a bit here on, of how those ratios were and can be determined moving forward. And more details there, but on screen, Amy mentioned an improved scale. This is a new risk and observability scale, and it builds off of what was originally used by those SME teams. The scale offers considerations for when span of control should be 1 to 0, such as when individuals' qualifications are required by regulation, perhaps, or there is an immediate risk of incorrect performance, or where a qualified observer can't avert incorrect performance. So those really should be where span of control shouldn't be utilized. And then down to low risk and low difficulty observations. And it also gives example tasks. And the committee hopes that this new resource will be helpful to operators using the B31Q standard in their programs. Amy, once SME's consensus occurs, the last step is to review the final product. And there's a note that ratios shall not be increased without further SME review or unless a data analysis establishes a rational basis for a greater ratio. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, honestly, I have never seen anyone increase a span of control. But the thought is that since the standard sets it as a maximum number, you can't just increase it without justification. So you have to use SME's opinions or logic to justify an increase, or there might be some performance data or other information that justifies it. Maybe there's new technology that makes it easier for a qualified person to witness multiple people or step in. I I really don't have a concrete example because I've never seen it. But this I do know, it's always okay to go above and beyond the standard and decrease the span of control. So no SMEs are needed for that.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for sharing your expertise. And it's time to enter your questions into the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. I'm looking at the time. We're about to run up on the hour, and we'll go over. But we know that to respect you'll be able to actually access this webinar if you have another meeting or something like that. Usually we keep these to an hour, but we're going to go over a little bit. But you can always access these recordings on our website. And we'll have that link in that follow-up email. So again, use the chat feed or not the chat feature, but the Q&A feature in Zoom and ask a question. And if we don't have time to hit it today, so we're not going to go forever, we'll get back to you as long as you leave your contact information. Let's recap what we call our top 5 takeaways from this edition. So in 2025 edition of B31Q, there's a new task added. It's a vacuum box inspection of tank welds. It's the 5th NDT, non-destructive testing task. 7 tasks were revised, some minor changes, so don't expect a whole lot of change there. Substantive change. Language shifted from may to should or shall to clarify what is permissive and what is mandatory and for consistency. And there were span of control updates. I just remember to put my camera back on. And look out for a new non-mandatory Appendix J in a coming edition, but and what we hope will be in a code case coming up. Don't forget about the opportunity about for obtaining those CEUs. Again, you can fill out a form in that follow-up email, and you can get a certificate for those. It's not too early to begin planning to attend the ITS User Conference in Nashville. This is going to be in September 30th to October 1st at the Downtown Hilton. That's only 1 block away from Broadway and a great time, maybe too good of a time sometimes for our guests. But our user conference is such an awesome opportunity to level up on best practices using ITS products, services, and get your hands on those latest features that can help your OQ program. You'll learn from operators and other contractors facing the same challenges you face, and you keep up with those latest industry innovations from the vendors that are on site. So mark it on your calendar. Registration is now underway, and you can register at this time. Again, we're going to take your questions. Question number 1, how can I get involved with B31Q? And Amy, feel free to jump in here too, but I think you can drop a line to me and I can connect you to ASME B31Qs. They have a distribution group called the Resource Development Group where you can get information as far as the next meeting's coming up, and sometimes there's questions asked or information seeking asked in that listserv. So that's one way to start getting tuned in. But feel free to reach out. Here's another, Amy, do you have any other on that one?
Just a reminder that B31Q, all meetings are open to the public. So even if you just want to come and see what it's about before kind of any formal commitment, you can reach out to either one of us and we can let you know when the next meeting is.
Thank you. How does someone asked, how does this the B31Q update affect utility construction companies? Amy, what do you think?
I really don't think any of these changes to B31Q have an effect. Maybe the addition of the new task. So if an operator implements the new task, that would be a change. But the rest of the changes were really minor wording, being more concise. I think the only other thing that you mentioned early on in your review of what's going on is the change in the Massachusetts regulations effective October 11th certainly may change things for those utilities and contractors that operate in Massachusetts.
Yeah, major impacts there, I imagine. So someone asked about span of control. Would that cover the qualified machine operator to their span of control spotter? So I guess a very specific question in excavation.
You want me to take that one?
Yeah, you wouldn't if you won't
My
mind.
my best effort. So to me, the machine operator and the spotter are two totally different tasks. So the span of control, you wouldn't apply those collectively. There's kind of no way that you can. Um, I will say B31Q does give some guidance in terms of a qualified individual who is directing and observing more than one task, more than one person, more than one task. And you have to follow the most stringent of the span of controls for the tasks that are involved. B31Q does not have a task for the machine operator, but we do for the spotter. And the span of control for spotter is 1 to 1. So there's no way that someone could direct and observe both of those things at the same time. The person on the machine, I would have to guess it's 1 to 0 anyway. I don't know how that could happen at all physically.
Well, hopefully that helps answer that person's question.
Maybe.
The B30, so someone asked, how does B31 relate to APGA SIF procedures? And I believe that is the American Public Gas Association Security and Integrity Foundation. And I just looked this up. They seem to offer O&M procedure templates for public-owned utilities. And I think it has a note that it is based on ASME B31Q, the task list. So it may inform or tie into the covered tasks. Another ask is, do you consider B31Q to be the standard in OQ, or in quotes, the standard, or are there any other emerging programs to watch? Yeah, I can mention the American Petroleum Institute recommended practice 1161 is an alternative for B31Q, but it is, as of its latest edition, it's now purely liquid pipeline focused. And so, ITS's programs its natural gas programs are based on ASME B31Q and federal regulation and industry input. And I can note that it's not necessarily a standard, but there is the operator qualification integrity process, or OQIP. eh, oqip.org if you want some more information. It really does it has I guess a guidance document, and it has some great considerations for raising the NOQ program's bar a little above and beyond uh, federal code. Former chair Mike Burkhart, thank you for being here and listening in. He wanted to add that one other provision that we added I believe in span of control was within that section was to ensure that if handoffs of qualified individuals take place, there really needs to be discussions between them before one just leaves the job site, which I think is incredible guidance, safety guidance there. Can't just expect someone to kind of just come in there and start observing without knowing where are we at in the performance of the job and those covered tasks. Another question, have you heard of any regulatory pushback for not requiring a performance evaluation on a requalification task that B31 suggests could be requalified with uh, only a knowledge evaluation as long as it has the required knowledge, skills, and abilities? Um, what kind of feedback, if any, has PHMSA or state regulators provided about the 2025? So I guess two questions. I guess, Amy, have you heard of any regulatory pushback where operators are, distinguishing between, um, the methods required for requalification versus initial qualification?
I have not.
Yeah,
Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I haven't.
I haven't either, but and I'm not aware of any feedback PHMSA or state regulators have provided about these new updates yet either. This is
Other than the ones who are involved in B31Q.
absolutely great to point
So
that out. Yes. And so, we'll have a meeting later this year. The edition just published. I think that takes a little time and time will tell. Another question. What challenges do you foresee in implementing the 2025 B31Q changes across large workforces? On this one, I don't know. I don't know if the lead
again,
can.
the only thing I can really see is there's a new task. The rest of the changes are important wording, but minor. I mean, they just clarify what we really intended to say.
Mhm.
It doesn't it doesn't, all the changes that ended up in a shall really were shalls before. So, in terms of what people and operators actually do, I don't see a change. But that one new task could be something that could be implemented, and I suggest that it's an NDT task and or something similar, and so it's a very specified spot where you would have to implement that. So specified impact.
Thank you. Someone asks, I guess this is around the NTSB preliminary investigation around the explosion in Missouri earlier this year. They asked what is meant by an uncapped gas main, and actually, I think I misspoke. The I just pulled up the preliminary investigation report, and it actually said that the fiber contractor drilled into an unmarked section of a capped underground. So it's actually it was unmarked, capped underground. I did not mean to say uncapped. So hopefully that helps. Um, let's see. Do you have an example of when an operator performs a task that meets the four questions, the four-part test, but justifies it as not being a covered task? I'm not familiar with any, but Amy, are you?
Nope.
Okay.
No. Yeah, not the four-part test. I mean, clearly there are some that, meet the two-part test that if you're following the four-part test, they, you know, aren't part of it, like new construction, some other kinds of things. But I cannot think of anything um, where that I can't imagine a justification. So, but they may have one. So it leaves it. B31Q really worked hard at um, instead of a performance prescriptive standard or a prescriptive standard, it's a performance standard. So it's kind of like, look, if you can come up with a better mousetrap, then then have at it. If you can justify what you're doing and you think it's better than what the standard uh, suggests, then by all means. And so that's kind of what that provision is for. I personally don't have any examples.
Thank you. And I know we're continuing to have still our audiences here, and I will go just a little longer. We've got a lot of questions and engagement, so this is fantastic. Um, Someone asks, if AOCs are to be task specific, will we be doing away with the generic AOC tasks? So I think that when task specific was mentioned, the now Massachusetts will have on its books at a state level the requirement for AOCs to be task specific. I know a lot of regulators, from my understanding, do kind of expect task specific AOCs in operator programs, and I think there's great value in still having a generic AOC task. Um, uh, it's really a catch-all. Some operators use it to, just folks that aren't even necessarily performing covered tasks, but they use that to come on site. So people are generally aware of, here are, some basics. I need to report, these signs of a leak, or I need to report here's what I do in these kind of situations. Amy, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. Someone asks, did Amy state that span of control included on-the-job training new hire? Wait, sorry, OTJ, so on the job training. For new hire training, trainer would be qualified.
So I think what I meant was the span of control of 1 to 1 or 1 to any more than just being, qualified yourselves is for the purpose of being able to have someone perform work under someone else's supervision. So, if you think about training, it's a long process, where first the experienced person helps the other person learn, what it is they're supposed to do, and then they practice under supervision, and then ultimately they could get signed off that they could do it independently. Well, it's that last little part there, particularly if they're performing this task, the qualification on a live line or whatever, that needs, you need to be able to have someone who's unqualified prior to becoming qualified, work with you in order to experience it. The first time someone does a task shouldn't be after they're qualified. It should be while they're being observed by someone who is. So um, I don't know if that clarifies it or not. So I'm not saying that your trainers have to be qualified. I'm saying span of control is about someone performing work who is not qualified and being directed and observed by someone who is. So it's that part where if they're performing the work on a live line, yes, then that trainer has to be qualified. If it's in a training room somewhere, no, not so much. Did that help, do you think?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was just looking through. Well, we have like two more questions. I think we'll take real quick. So, following initial qualification, may a performance evaluation be utilized for subsequent qualification if appropriate for the task, as is deemed by the operator, but without the knowledge assessment? So, do you want to take that one?
You read that one more time.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, well, yeah, following initial qualification, um, this person's asking, may a performance evaluation be utilized for the subsequent, for the requalification, if appropriate for the task and as deemed by the operator, but without the knowledge assessment?
So y- when you're performing a performance test, you are also evaluating knowledge at the same time. So what I would suggest is B31Q says you have to cover everything, all the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are necessary for that particular task. So if you have special knowledge requirements that were in your written test that you're not getting at, that's a problem. But you can get at that, by asking questions while they're performing the work. So there are ways to do it orally while the work is being performed. Um, and the regulation does not allow just work performance by itself. either. So, you're going to have a conversation during that performance evaluation, either way you look at it. Otherwise, it's just you standing there watching them perform it. So, what I'm saying is, if your performance evaluation includes the discussion of all of the knowledge that's necessary to perform the work, then absolutely yes, um, that's a good thing to do.
Yeah. Um, just speaking of the ITS program, we can support anything an operator deems. So it's really crucial for an operator to document that. That has to be in their plan. It has to align with their plan in their program. But for our program, uh, we don't differentiate between requalification requirements versus uh, initial. Just for anyone out there, don't get confused about ITS's program. Um, and I think we'll take this one. So if an operator does not perform the task in-house, but a contractor does it for them, do they need to have it on their task list?
Yes, they do, because it's the operator. It's up to the operator to have a task list of the work that's performed on their facilities. It is not up to a contractor to have their own task list. So yes, you have to have that task on your list, and the contractors have to follow your requirements.
Thank you. So we went way over. It was awesome. Thank you all for sticking around. Amy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise
Thank you.
and for being here. And so y'all please mark your calendar for our next regulation navigation topic to be determined. We like to keep it relevant. I'm thinking maybe we'll be talking about some of these ANRPMs possibly, but that is tentatively scheduled for September 10th. So stay tuned for more. We'll have information coming out in email. Really appreciate you being here today and making this industry safer. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.